Today I'm going to be talking about why I'm playing Risk of Rain 2, which hot dropped a few weeks ago, actually at the Gearbox panel during PAX East, and is currently available in early access on Steam for $19.99. Now, the devs haven't talked about console or other platforms, but the game has already seen over 500,000 players in its first few weeks, so who knows? Maybe once they actually finish development of the PC version, which I believe is planned to be in early access for about a year, we could see some form of a console release, but they are focused entirely on PC right now. Now, Risk of Rain and Risk of Rain 2 are developed and were developed by Hopoo Games, which I'd like to point out is a development team of like less than a dozen people. It might even be less than like 7 people. It's a really small team that managed to make this beautiful and stunning game. That's probably the first thing that really stood out to me about Risk of Rain 2 is much like its 2D counterpart, it's really moody and vibey. Like, Risk of Rain always had an amazing aesthetic, and taking it into the realm of 3D has just made that aesthetic pop a lot more. It's almost like an oil painting meets cell shading. And all of the weird little aesthetical tidbits that make up the Hopoo art team shine even brighter in Risk of Rain 2 in these 3D worlds. It's moody, vibey sci-fi at its best. It has a very Lost in Space feel for me, and even when you're playing in co-op, there's that really, like, big feel of aloneness. You know, I think in a lot of ways it reminds me of Interstellar, where there was this really impending sense of doom, of just being out there in the vastness of it. And while you're on these like individual planets, you still get that vibe in Risk of Rain 2, because you're just jumping through like one mysterious portal after the next and just ending up in the abyss. And without spoiling it, the last sort of level you can reach in the game is very like Alone in Space feel. And I love that. I adore that. There's just something really special about the world that they've built in Risk of Rain 2 with this like wonderfully minimalistic art direction. You know, there's not necessarily a lot of like crazy textures or polys going on, but what's there says so much to the player. And there's a lot of beautiful effects work. A lot of the lighting has this gorgeous sort of neon glow to it. It's just a game that's a lot of fun to play just on the basis of what you see and also what you hear. Chris Christodoulou has returned to do the soundtrack on this game once again, and he has crushed it. Everything that's there in early access is beautiful. It's aggressive, and it just kind of completes the mood. It seals the deal, if you will. When you're in like a big section of action and the music kicks in, just kind of keeps you going. It keeps you moving, right? It's almost like the music is playing to the pace of the experience, and that really does a lot for me from a gameplay and from an overall experience perspective. I think the big thing about Risk of Rain 2, though, when we move forward and start to talk about the actual gameplay experience, is that it's pretty accessible as far as roguelikes go. I'm a pretty big fan of roguelikes in general, but I'm also a bit of a masochist when it comes to them because I've never been very good at them. I play a lot of roguelikes. I own a lot of roguelikes, from Teleglitch to Rogue Legacy to Binding of Isaac to the original Risk of Rain to Dead Cells. Like, the list just goes on and on and on. I always find myself buying them, but I'm usually pretty terrible at them. Enter the Gungeon is a great example. It's a game that I play constantly, but I never make it very far in. I just like the formula of roguelikes, and I often like the gameplay experiences that they offer. I'm just not really that good at persisting and like seeing them through to the end. That's the cool thing about Risk of Rain 2, at least now in its early access phase, is that you can see the end of the game. You can play it on easy, and even on normal, with a group of 4, or even a group of 2, you can totally see the end and then loop around and go right into like a New Game Plus run as a part of that initial run. They don't make it impossible. It does have a sort of scaling difficulty system where the longer you spend in any one session, the harder the game gets, and that's kind of how they eventually crush you. Is that regardless of your initial difficulty selection, the game's going to keep getting harder and harder and harder and harder until you eventually fail. That is, after all, the point of a roguelike, is to just kind of crush you at some point. But the game waits long enough to do that, and it really does a good job in scaling its difficulty with that timed difficulty scaler to the point where you can play on your first run, even solo, for easily 20 to 30 minutes. 20 to 30 minutes, you'll probably even face the first boss if you can figure that out quickly enough, and it creates an instantly rewarding and gratifying experience that really says to the player, go ahead, have another run. And that was my first experience with Risk of Rain 2, was like, okay, I soloed it, and then I immediately wanted to play it in co-op. So I jumped into some quick play and ended up having a 2.5-hour run with a group of randoms. Like, so I went from a 25-minute run to a 2.5-hour run, not really knowing what the hell I was doing, but essentially being carried through the experience by these 3 people who did, and it was really fun. It definitely kind of set the hook in me, and I didn't want to stop playing the game. And since then, I've had a lot of those like long 1 hour, 45-minute runs. In a lot of ways, Risk of Rain 2 is more of a marathon roguelike experience, where Dead Cells can have really long runs. I think it's a game that you can pick up fully knowing that if you just want to be ultra aggressive and take high risks, you can die in like 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 2 minutes even, right? It's a good small session game. Risk of Rain 2, the more you play it, the more it becomes a good marathon game, where on like a Friday night, you and some friends might sit down and then binge like a 2.5-hour run, see just how far you can get, and then maybe call it quits after that first run. It works really well in that regard, and I think it just sets the player up for success and for a better way of actually learning the game. You are going to fail eventually, but you spend enough time in the world actually experiencing it and picking up items where you can actually start to develop an understanding for how the game systems work, and you can get an understanding for what items might be the best for your different character class, and obviously the individual character classes themselves. At its core, this game is ridiculously replayable, and not in the often traditional and frustrating sense that roguelikes are replayable in that they force you to die so you can play it again and again and again, but in that there's a lot of variation to each and every run you might make in Risk of Rain 2. The different character classes are extremely diverse and unique. They all function differently. They have their own appearances, their own styling, their own weaponry. You know, you've got the mercenary who's all about close quarters, sword-focused combat, and like a lot of movement tech. You've got the little robot guy who's got 2 different fire modes, a railgun or a nail gun, who can also carry 2 like active items. There's just so much going on there that you could play Risk of Rain for, you know, like 6 hours as one character class, and then switch character classes and have an entirely different experience that requires an entirely different play style. And when you play in co-op, which is where I definitely recommend you play the game, you also have all of the cooperative elements that come into play. So while you're racing that clock to get from one zone to the next while keeping the difficulty as low as possible, you're going to need to farm enemies to get coin, which you then use to unlock chests scattered throughout the different worlds. That's how you gain access to items in this game. So if you're playing in co-op, you don't want to just like hoard all the items for yourself and then totally screw over a bunch of your teammates. And that's where this can be a really good 4-player co-op loot shooter for a group of friends who are willing to work well together. You can actively go around and say, okay, you're playing mercenary, this movement-focused ability, this feather, is going to be better for you. And so there's this whole like extra dynamic that comes into play when you play in co-op, and you actually start to develop an understanding for the items that makes the game even more enjoyable than it was when you were probably just blind running it, seeing just how far you could get for the first few runs with a group of friends. I think the next big thing about this game for me, and the thing that could really draw in a lot of people, and I think that has already drawn in a lot of people, considering they've already seen over 500,000 players, and I checked the community hub this morning when I hopped on to start doing this commentary, 20,000 people playing this game right now at like 10 o'clock in the morning on a Wednesday. That really says a lot, right? That's really impressive. I think a lot of that comes down to this third-person presentation. I think a lot of roguelikes are 2D, right? They're platform-focused, and for a lot of people, that sort of old-school style platformer aesthetic, it's not really that appealing, right? But when you showcase a game that is basically a third-person shooter with all these character classes, it looks a lot more like a third-person loot shooter that happens to be roguelike than a roguelike game that happens to have loot shooter elements in it. And I think that's going to draw a lot of people into the fray, regardless of it being a roguelike. And I think that's a great thing. It's definitely the sort of game that I would recommend to people who maybe like the idea of roguelikes, but who have usually been turned away by them. I just think there's a lot of things in the design of the game here that make it more accessible and more appealing for a variety of skill levels, and for people who just really like loot shooters. who usually don't like roguelikes. I think it meshes these two things together really well, which is interesting because in a lot of ways, this is Risk of Rain. Like, it's very similar to the first game. It's just a whole perspective change with a lot of like small new ideas thrown into the mix. You know, the game obviously has a lot of room to grow and evolve from this point on, as it is still in early access, and they're looking at like another year of development, I believe they said. But it just shows what happens when you make a perspective change and how much that can affect the experience, and I think how much that can open your game up to a new audience. It's really cool, and I'm really excited for Hopoo. I'm stoked that they got this publishing opportunity with Gearbox. I think that reveal during the Borderlands 3 reveal at the Gearbox panel at PAX East was a big deal for them. And just seeing how well the game is sold and like the reviews for it and the audience it's already gathered, that's so cool, man. Because Hopoo's just been making these really cool small games, and to finally see one of their products really blow up is fantastic. And I think indie games over the past few years have been just crushing it. In the general gaming scene, and you've got games like Stardew Valley selling better than Call of Duty and stuff, you know? So this is just, I think, another one of those awesome moments for the realm of indie games, especially super small indie teams like the Hopoo team, and I honestly cannot recommend Risk of Rain 2 enough. It's a really good game. Even in early access, you're going to get your money's worth. Like, you could play this game for 20 plus hours without a doubt. Just experiencing all the different character classes, you could be here for a really long time. There are some things that I don't particularly love about the game right now, but they're not huge game breakers. I'm not a fan of fall damage. I don't think the game needs fall damage. It made sense in the original Risk of Rain because it was a very platform-focused 2D experience, and moving from one platform to the next during combat while evading enemies was a huge part of the gameplay, the core gameplay loop. Not so much here. It's not really a concern. Some classes even have like a movement ability where you could technically cancel out the fall damage, but then others don't, and they kind of get panned for it. I just think it should be removed. It doesn't add any value to the game. It doesn't add any fun. It doesn't add anything to the core gameplay loop. I would do away with that entirely. The game also currently uses a persistent currency system called lunar coins. So these lunar coins have a chance to drop during a run, and you need to collect them in order to access the other character classes as well as some items for your loot pool. I'm like kind of on the fence about this. When I first heard about it, my buddy Alex was explaining to me last night when we were playing. I really hadn't been able to figure it out. I was like, what are these coins? I don't understand how I unlock characters. And he's like, oh, this is how it works. A part of me was like, I don't like that. I don't like the RNG side of like earning characters, but I've now played about 7 hours of the game and I have all the characters unlocked. So it wasn't as if it took me forever to unlock them through this RNG system. I guess I would like a more progression, straightforward focus system, but there's also a chance that that could sort of lock out a lot of the characters from people who maybe struggle to understand the game as quickly as someone like myself did. So that RNG kind of, I guess, guarantees to some extent that you're going to get all the characters at some point. I definitely would like to see a little bit more information on it, like, you know, at what point should the player be guaranteed to have all of the character classes? Is there a number that they've sort of done in-house for the RNG of those lunar coins, or is there just a way that system could be made better? That's about it as far as nitpicks go. The game obviously has room to grow. The dev team's already talking about making changes. They're very receptive to feedback. They're already looking at like the fire damage, which is really OP on the player right now. It's a really frustrating way to die. So I'm really excited to see where this game grows. If you like third-person, action shooty games, and you've kind of always been on the fence about roguelikes, I think Risk of Rain 2 is the best possible time to dive in and give it a go, especially for only $20. Of course, if you want to wait and see where the game goes in development, there's nothing wrong with that. Check back in on it, put it on your wish list, keep it on your radar. I'll definitely be hopping back into the game, giving you guys little updates as it gets substantial expansions to its current core. That's going to do it for me today, though, guys. I want to give a huge shout-out to everybody over on Patreon who's been supporting this new direction for the channel. I, for one, am very excited about it. If you'd like to become a Patreon supporter and support what I'm doing on the channel, you'll get access to things like our community Discord, as well as 2 exclusive Patreon videos every single month. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.
You have been brought here for a purpose. The most important